Hello and welcome to a very special Monday YouTube live stream. Yes, hello YouTube. How are you? I am Adam Levitan. I'm one of the co-founders here at ETR. I am joined by Drew Dinkmeyer. I am joined by Mike Leone, two of the best DFS players in the world. Drew, what's going on this fine Monday afternoon, evening?
I'm just excited. A 2-game slate. I like these Monday double headers, even if they come at the grave conditions that are with the world in a pandemic. I appreciate a double header.
Yeah, 2-game slates are great. You know, I play a lot of the mini slates. I would prefer get up to 3 or 4, but 2-game slates certainly can be fun. And one thing that happens on these 2-game slates is you end up with a ton of action because everybody's excited about these 4 teams and everybody knows they can watch the games. Mike Leone, what's up, buddy?
Oh, not too much. Just put up the user comment. Bill O'Brien's been fired from Houston. Maybe they'll let Deshaun Watson cook and take up from Seattle. But with Romeo Crennel there, I don't see too much of that happening. But I'm excited for a 2-game slate. Probably a little more stressed than Drew is. You know, Drew's over there enjoying playing this 2-game slate. I'm over here, trying to get these Green Bay projections right with Devontae Adams out and Lazard out. We got quarterback switch in New England. We got Sony Michel out there. So it's an interesting slate to dissect because there's a lot of uncertainty for only 2 games.
How hard can it be, Mike? Green Bay has only 3 wide receivers on the roster and 45 tight ends. How hard can this be?
Yeah.
Well, Drew, you should know better than most if you played some midweek Taylor on Showdown last week. It can be hard.
Fair.
Okay, we're going to get to the 2-game slate in a minute here, and we'll talk through the projections, some of the assumptions that go along with them. But first, I wanted to recap a little bit about what happened yesterday because I'm going to talk about this on the solo pod tomorrow. But man, in week 3, it was obviously Russ, Lockett, Metcalf, bring it back with a Cowboy. This week, obviously, Dak, Amari, one of his pieces, bring it back with Odell. And for both of those to actually hit is insane. Am I right, Drew? To actually identify the stack that looks like the right stack before the slate starts, not worried about ownership, just literally the best slate before, and then have that be the actual winning stack that you needed on the week is insane. And people are now I'm going to start playing the chalk stack every week. And I understand that you needed some contrarian pieces around it. I understand that CeeDee Lamb and Dalton Schultz were not that owned. But just to have it come in is, Dallas, Cleveland, let me play Odell, let me play Dak with his best receiver, Amari, and one other piece, and that's what hits. It seems like it's really rare. For it to happen 2 weeks in a row, I don't know. I think it's blowing some people's minds. So what do you think about what's going on right now at the top of GPPs?
Yeah, it's been weird. And I talked about this in my leverage article last week that essentially the wide receivers that are kind of chalky have been predictably hitting well, and the running backs who are chalky have been falling apart. And we even had it yesterday in 2 chalk running backs that you felt could be kind of as bulletproof as needed. And they both got, 20 DraftKings points. They were fine. But it's hard to win a GPP with 20 from at least really large field stuff. You can win smaller field stuff, but 20 from an 8K player. And so it's been wild. It's just a credit to kind of the disparity that we see between some of the play calling. This is one of the things that's great about this analytics era in the NFL when you're getting more teams that are pushing forward kind of more aggressively in terms of their play calling and their passing. They're starting to separate from the field in terms of pass attempts and opportunities. And Dallas's defense is just so bad that they're just getting into these shootouts left and right. And it's been very predictable early on. The amazing thing is it hasn't been coming with insane ownership. That's the really wild thing. And even this week, the Seattle guys started to get up there with ownership, Lockett and Metcalf and Russ, but the Dallas guys didn't. And, I guess Amari probably ended up in the teens. Lamb and Schultz were still really low owned because of Zeke, because everybody wants to play Zeke and it gets tricky with stacks. And so it's created this really unique situation that has been really fun to play in GPPs for a guy who doesn't want to go too far off the board in terms of contrarian choices.
Yeah, even I have been having fun playing GPPs. I've been making 6 or 10 GPP teams by hand, of course, for the latest few weeks. And I've been having a lot of fun with it too, because I didn't feel that great about Zeke. I didn't feel that great about DJ Moore. I didn't feel that great about Brandon Cooks. I played all those guys in cash and happened to lose a Kia on it, but I didn't feel great about playing them in tournaments. And so, yeah, you can just see it happening really cleanly for tournaments right now. I don't know how long this is going to last. Leone, you have your team that you did with Holka and Peter Overzet, the Mans, the artist formerly known as the Mans, unfortunately, up right now. What do you think about what's going on in tournaments right now on DraftKings?
Yeah, I mean, what Drew was saying was interesting. The ownership, Cooper 14%, Lamb 4%. If you go over to Drew's team, a similar type build, he had Schultz at 5%. I mean, getting those low and pass catchers, I think, was key. With the Metcalf, Lockett, Russ situation last week, you knew who exactly the guys would be, so the ownerships got inflated. But I think at some point we're going to see the chalk RB situation turn around. We've been projecting the chalk RBs as the best RB plays the last couple of weeks, and they failed. So it hasn't been that we thought these RBs were going to fail. We thought they were the best plays. It's just based on ownership. We liked how much we could potentially get paid off if they did fail. And I still played Kamara in my lineup. It worked out okay, but of course, faded Zeke, was able to get Mixon at really low ownership. I think people get really scared when guys are on injury reports, and you have to think through game scripts too. Mixon was in a pretty bad game script the first 3 weeks for the Bengals. Now they're finally home favorites against a bad Jacksonville team, and a guy who was a first, second round pick 3 weeks ago, no one's playing at 5,800 because an injury report status, and 3 weeks of production that I think honestly had nothing to do with what his production was going to be like this week.
Yeah, totally agree. One other thing that I've noticed, especially on DraftKings, is it almost feels like, and maybe it speaks to the state of today's NFL, where it's so in favor of the offense. They're even calling fewer penalties now, and scoring is so up that the wide receivers in the high 5K up to like high 6K range almost feel safer than the running backs. Like, gosh, give me Beckham and Galladay and Thielen and Devontae Parker and Amari Cooper and all these guys, and they feel safer than Kenyon Drake and Josh Jacobs and even other running backs that played well. Do you think this is a change in what's going on in the NFL, Dink, or do you think this is a small thing? Because before it would have been like, I would never play ever if I was looking for a 6K wide receiver over a 6K running back.
Yeah, I think what we've seen kind of early in the season is, and I don't know, I haven't actually looked at the data as a whole, but I feel like you're getting fewer running back targets than we have in the past. And as a result, you're seeing a little bit less security in some of the running backs. I know that's been like the Kenyon Drake problem, right? He just hasn't gotten any targets in the passing game. We saw Jonathan Taylor get a ton of targets the first week and then like nothing the last few weeks. And so some of these guys who we thought there might be more consistent target shares there at the running back position haven't been there. But I think it's more likely than not kind of a smaller sample situation. Obviously, like if you look at Odell's game logs, yeah, you felt pretty safe this week at 5,800, but it hasn't felt that way the other few weeks, right? So I think some of it is also we've been able to more clearly identify some of these high octane matchups where things feel a little bit safer.
Okay, before we move to the 2 game slate, Leone, I want to ask you about tight ends, because what's been going on at tight end, and this is on brand, and my best teams also had Troutman yesterday. The position is so bad that you can take zeros, you can take 1 point from Logan Thomas, you can take 3 points from other guys, and still have nut teams because other people are spending 4K, 5K, 6K even to get like 6 points or 7 points. I don't know if this is a long-term trend, but spending down at tight end has always been a preferred strategy for me. What do you think about what's going on at tight end, Leone?
Yeah, if you look at these top 3 teams in the 1,500, that me, Peter, and Holker were able to win. The team in third place had Logan Thomas at 1.8. Team in second place had Mike Gesicki, scored 2.5, and we won with a 0 from Adam Troutman. And that's actually the third week in a row I've come first or second in a tournament with a tight end that scored less than 3 points. So it's been absolutely wild. I think it'll turn around a little bit. We've also had some of the elite tight ends not on the main slate. This week, again, with Kelsey and Kittle not on the main slate. Mark Andrews did really well. It was just, even still, the volume's not huge. He catches 2 touchdowns and still doesn't quite have a GPP breaking performance at 6K. The one thing Drew and I talked about on our Saturday Establish the Million show is because tight end's so volatile, it's really worth correlating it. And I think even if it's a third guy in a triple stack or a second guy bringing back, like if you had just played Schultz or even Austin Hooper as your tight end in these Cleveland Dallas stacks, that would have really opened up your ceiling. And because it's so volatile, I think it makes sense to just correlate it with your game stack a lot of the times. It definitely makes sense to avoid the chalk because it's so volatile. I say that having taken a 0 on a 30% owned guy who was shaky to play a lot, and turns out he did not play a lot. I watched him run one play where it took him like 5 seconds to get off the bump and get past 5 yards. So that was a little brutal, but I think if you're going to eat chalk at tight end, it should be cheap chalk. And that's what happened this last week. And the other thing I wanted to note that, Drew's really beat into my brain the past year or so is, make smart teams. You don't have to be contrarian everywhere. And you'll see, my team, Dink's team, it's a mix of chalk and contrarian plays. So you don't have to, go completely off the wall at every single position. You just want a couple low-owned guys, and you don't want, the 3 chalk guys all together that are obvious each week.
The thing that I wanted to hit home on that tight end point is the change in the DraftKings pricing. The quarterbacks getting priced up higher, the min-floor quarterbacks, the min-floor running backs getting priced up higher, but the tight ends not moving really in pricing is making it so that if you get 6K Mark Andrews for 22 points versus a 6K wide receiver for 22 points, the difference is even if you want to take a 0, you can't find a $2,500 wide receiver to take a 0, right? Yeah. So you need the tight ends that are priced similarly to the wide receivers to outperform them, basically because of the gap in the pricing salary that you'll be able to get elsewhere, especially if you're playing these high dollar, high octane stacks. And so that's one of the things that I think is getting overlooked a little bit, is just how this change in the DraftKings floor pricing for running backs and quarterbacks is having a huge impact on roster construction on the whole. And I think that's why you're seeing, in addition to tight end performances being more volatile and less ceiling games, you're seeing the ceiling games from the higher end tight ends not funnel up as much because of the salary relief you can get at that position and then apply it to other positions.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Okay. Wanted to remind everyone we're putting a bunch of effort into our YouTube channel here, trying to grow it. We'd appreciate if you guys hit the subscribe button on our YouTube page. And also wanted to mention that if you are not a member, we do have weekly passes available. We do have monthly passes available. And of course, you can still get the full season pass access to everything that we do. Okay, 2-game slate tonight, a surprise 2-game slate, but 4 very popular teams. Let's talk generally about 2-game slates. One thing about playing 2-game slates is it's really hard to fade the best plays in 2-game slates because the number of guys who can beat them. On yesterday's slate, we could have said, well, I can pick 7 guys who maybe can beat Alvin Kamara. It's not likely, but maybe they can beat Alvin Kamara. On this slate, finding someone to beat Aaron Jones and Clyde Edwards-Helaire is just not happening. So on 2-game slates, it's way, way, way different. Drew, how do you think about 2-game slates from a strategy perspective just as a whole?
So I'll take this as like thinking through it from an MME perspective and an optimizer perspective, because that's really how I approach a lot of slates in general. The first thing that you have to remember, when the smaller the amount of games you have players to choose from, the looser the constraints you should be having on an optimizer. Because an optimizer, essentially, when you're doing stacking rules or when you're doing number of uniques in a lineup or different things like that, you're trying to filter through the number of combinations into ones that might be more optimal. But when you already have a smaller number of combinations as a starting point, you don't need to filter through them as much. So one of the things that I think a lot of people who use optimizers that might make a mistake on a small slate is they might be used to having 0 players allowed versus their defense. Shouldn't do that on a 2-game slate, right? Because it's very easy for the optimal defense to also have skill players against it. And so I think you certainly still want to stack quarterbacks, but you want to, if you make rules where you limit the number of wide receivers or running backs or tight ends without the quarterback stacked, you want to loosen up rules like that. You want to loosen up rules of players against their own defense. You want to allow for weird combinations as well, because weird combinations have a better chance at being unique as well. And it's very difficult to be unique on a 2-game slate. And every time your lineup is duplicated, you lose a little bit of expected value. So from an optimizer standpoint, from an MME standpoint, as a player who is playing a 2-game slate, I treat it very differently than a full 10 to 13 game slate.
By the way, if you guys are interested in using our projections with an optimizer, we do have a partnership with our friends at Fantasy Labs. If you go to establishthorun.com, go to the drop down under DFS, you'll see a page there that will link you up and get you all set there. You do get our projections preloaded and my ownership projections preloaded on the main slate. Leone, for people hand building like men for this two game slate. I think there's a lot of things that we've talked about in the Winning Millie Makers Trends article, which is up on the site and on the podcast that we did about things that we like about double stacking and bringbacks and total ownership. I think you can throw a lot of that out the window on a 2-game slate. When you're hand building for 2 games, what do you look at?
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely onslaught in a 2-game slate. You don't have to. I think sometimes people are trying too much to get the best play from every game. And I think there's some flaws in that, or from every team. And then you take, when you take the 4 best plays from the 4 different teams, 1, you end up with a pretty chalky team. But 2, when you look at the correlation, I remember this from some of the playoff slates last year, especially when you get teams like the Chiefs, you get the high total game with Green Bay, Atlanta. I mean, you can really do a triple stack with 2 bringbacks. So you can really do a full onslaught. And then the other thing is, don't be too crazy about players against your defense, especially on a 2-game slate. Defense is so volatile. One big play can make things happen. And something Jonathan Bales, our friend from Fantasy Labs, has looked at and researched, but you actually want defenses in shootouts sometimes because the pace of the game is fast. A lot of plays are being run. A lot of plays are being pass attempts, which means those are chances at sacks. Those are chances at turnovers. So I wouldn't limit yourself to like 1 skill player against your defense. I think you want 2, even maybe 3 skill players against your defense, especially when pricing gets really funny. If there's a really cheap defense because they're expected to give up points, I wouldn't necessarily rule them out, even in the same game where you're playing a few guys against that defense.
Okay, let's get to this slate. And this is a especially messy slate because of all of the injury and news. Cam Newton is not going to play. Devontae Adams is not going to play. Alan Lazard, who starred last week on the Showdown slate, is not going to play. Sony Michel has been ruled out. Damian Harris is up. Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley were both on injury report, but they're going to play. Even as we go down further, Mercedes Lewis is listed doubtful. We don't know. Right now, the Packers only have 3 active wideouts on their roster. They might be calling up Robert Foster, Australian, for sex, or they might be calling up the Bagel Man, Reggie Bagleton. So there are a lot of moving parts for a 2-game slate. It is a very tricky 2-game slate. I want to quickly, and we're not going to do a full deep dive here like we normally do on Friday nights, position by position. I want to quickly run through position by position here for the 2-game slate. I think that we can start at the quarterback position, Leone, if you want to bring those projections up. Silva speculated that Brian Hoyer might not even make it through the game. They might have a quick hook on Brian Hoyer and go to Jarrett Stidham. Does that completely bring Brian Hoyer out of play for you, Dink, even if you're playing a ton of lineups? And how are you thinking about handling the quarterback position here?
Yeah, so I would say I would always want a small allocation to a position that it's hard to separate from the field. Obviously, when you have Patrick Mahomes, it's a little bit easier to separate from the field. But I'll probably have a very small allocation to Hoyer. It's a slate that the salary constraints aren't really particularly challenging because of all those injury issues that you talked about, because of some of the cheaper options that you have on the New England and the Green Bay side because of these injuries. And so as a result, I don't think you need much of them, but I'd probably still have a little bit if I'm running 150 sets. But in general, the quarterbacks are really going to funnel the ownership between Ryan, Mahomes, and Rodgers. I would guess that just based on the way the pricing is on the slate, that Mahomes and still commands probably the highest ownership of the group. He's the easiest to stack. You're gonna, no matter what you do, you're gonna play a few KC guys, right? Like that's kind of like a natural approach to this slate. So I think the guy that will probably be a little bit more contrarian of the 3 is probably Aaron Rodgers. Everybody's gonna play Aaron Jones. He's gonna be the top running back projected on the slate. People are going to still want to run stacks, and they're going to be like, how do I stack Aaron Rodgers when he's got no Devontae Adams? He's got no Lazard. He's got who am I stacking him with? And so I think Rodgers is the guy that will trail Ryan and Mahomes in ownership.
From a projection standpoint, Leone, how do you handle it when Aaron Rodgers is out there with a bunch of stiffs, a bunch of geeks off the street? Because we are projecting his 3-wide set to be something like Marquez Valdez-Scantling, Darius Shepard, and
Malik Taylor.
Tyler Irvin, maybe.
And yeah, so Tyler Irvin is listed as a running back on both sites, I believe. He did run 13 routes last week, and he lined up in the slot or wide, I believe, on 22 out of 23. But anyways, back to the question, Leone. Aaron Rodgers would be projecting better if he had Devontae Adams, obviously, but how do you factor that in to the hashtag math?
Yeah, and Reggie Bagleton got called up, I believe, and might play. It's difficult, but the way our projections work is it takes into account, the wide receivers' skill levels and the talent levels that we project for them moving forward. So when you allocate, Devontae Adams's targets to Marquez Valdes-Scantling, and you take Lazard's targets, you give them to Darius Shepard, and give some more to the tight ends than we would expect, that's going to reduce Rodgers' efficiency. His completion percentage for sure comes down that we're projecting, because Devontae Adams is a guy that's a really high catch rate. So it comes down quite a bit. The one aspect where it hasn't come down a ton, the biggest team total on Green Bay hasn't moved a lot. So we're still projecting a healthy amount of passing touchdowns for Aaron Rodgers, which is why he out projects Matt Ryan, even though Matt Ryan's likely going to attempt more passes. Matt Ryan has better receivers. We might even expect a little bit of better efficiency in terms of yards per attempt, but that team total for the Packers, gives us confidence in the TD rate for Aaron Rodgers still being good. And as Dink said, that might make him an interesting contrarian play, where the people paying up are going to go to Mahomes, and the people not paying up to Mahomes are going to try and get that value with Matt Ryan, whose price tag is super cheap. I brought up the Green Bay pass catchers just so you could see how ugly it is. But if you go back to the quarterbacks on the slate, Ryan at 6,200. They've priced some guys down so that you can mix and match and get in a good amount of studs. So I expect him to be pretty popular.
Yeah, for sure. And honestly, obviously, the weaponry for Matt Ryan is healthy. We're projecting both Julio and Calvin Ridley to be at 100% or close to it tonight, even though they are at on the injury report. Okay, let's go to running back. Aaron Jones has some Alvin Kamara-like skills. And one thing about Kamara is, nobody bitches about Alvin Kamara when he comes off the field. Alvin Kamara is still a smash play because he catches so many balls. Aaron Jones is going to come off the field plenty. We're going to see Jamal Williams. We might see some other guys, but similar to Alvin Kamara, Aaron Jones is going to be a big, big part of the pass game. I think Aaron Jones is a very tough fade tonight. What do you think about what's going on at the running back position as a whole on this 2-game slate, Dink?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of lineups are going to basically come preloaded with Aaron Jones and Clyde Edwards-Helaire. The rest of the running back positions, even if they're guys that project okay, like Todd Gurley projects okay, James White in his return projects okay, it's not going to be situations that people have much confidence in. So, you have to play 2 running backs, and I mean, these guys are probably going to be greater than 75% owned, maybe greater than 80% owned. I mean, so right off the bat, any lineup that you play that doesn't have one of these guys is got a little bit more of a shot to be unique, because they're just going to command so much ownership, and the price tags aren't prohibitive either. That's the other thing. Clyde Edwards-Helaire in the low 6s when he started to be involved in the passing game the way we expected when he was drafted, that opening night was a little bit confusing. But since then, he's been used in the passing game pretty consistently. And Aaron Jones, what we've seen from Aaron Jones the last year and a half, basically when Devontae Adams sits, they use him a ton in the passing game. Mm-hmm. And it gets to the Kamara without Michael Thomas type situation. And so really, really hard to get off these guys. If you're playing one lineup, and you're not totally going first or last Ricky Bobby style, you're probably playing those 2 guys at running back.
Leone, I think maybe I was going to say maybe we could find someone that could beat Helaire or Aaron Jones, but I don't even know if I can even make a case for it. James White has missed 2 straight games due to the passing of his father. He's coming back tonight. We don't know exactly what his role is going to be, but Rex Burkhead played reasonably well in his absence. Sonny Michel went on IR, which would have helped clarify this backfield a little bit, but then they call back up Damian Harris, who's expected to play and get some of those Sonny Michel carries. Is there anyone you can see here that might be able to beat Aaron Jones or Clyde Edwards, or at least get close enough where we can save the money and use it to stack up wide receiver?
Yeah, I mean, that's what makes this slate so difficult. We had the 2-game slate week 1 when you had Derrick Henry as massive chalk, you had James Conner and Saquon Barkley, but you still had Melvin Gordon for Denver. So you had three pretty stud workhorse running backs and another guy who is, pretty good. Here you get Todd Gurley at 5,500. They're trying to draw you in, but his involvement in the passing game, since he was super inefficient in the passing game week 1, has been almost zero, which is a flag. And we haven't seen him make many big plays. The best thing you can say about Todd Gurley is he's going to see 15 rush attempts and has a decent shot at goal line work. And then the New England situation is so up in the air with White. Burkhead had the huge week last week. Now you get Damian Harris back, but Sony Michel's out. Do they still play JJ Taylor some? I'd probably avoid Damian Harris the first week back. I think Burkhead and White are both interesting. I think they do have ceilings where White could just get a whole bunch of checkdowns, and Burkhead's goal line work could go way up. And we saw the 3 touchdowns last week. You don't have Cam Newton there to vulture. Well, I guess Burkhead's more vulturing Cam than the other way around. So yeah, I'm almost more into the New England guys than I am into Gurley, just because I think they're going to be a lot less owned than Gurley, and they're probably closer to Gurley than Gurley is to Elaire and Aaron Jones. So if I was getting, a little funky with my lineups, that's what I would do. And the other thing too, if you're getting off one of the more expensive running backs to drop down to the New England back, this one of the stacks that makes a lot of sense is Matt Ryan with the expensive receivers, with Julio, with Ridley in the upper 6Ks.
Yep. Okay. Let's go to that wide receiver position because it is pretty stacked. And, if you're playing both Aaron Jones and Elaire, you can't fit in Tyreek and Julio and Ridley. So, Drew, how are you thinking about the wide receiver position on this 2-game slate?
Yeah, I think most of the ownership will roll through Tyreek, and then I think Ridley will probably be more owned than Julio, even though that Julio is cheaper and considered kind of the alpha coming in. I just think Ridley's game logs are going to be so appealing that it's going to bring people in. Edelman, I can't get a real good feel on for ownership between Edelman, like Harry, and people if they're comfortable playing multiple New England pieces without Hoyer, because I don't think a lot of people are going to play Hoyer. So I think the Patriots in general are they're kind of an interesting thing on this slate where if they throw a lot because they're behind and they end up getting a lot of reception value that's really cheap, they actually could be like the way that this slate breaks, even if they're not scoring a lot of points, just because they're the access point to all the higher end guys. So I think it'll be really interesting to see kind of how ownership breaks down. But I think while I think Tyreek Hill has like the highest upside and projects the best of these guys, I think he also probably has the lowest floor, just given that Kansas City can spread it around so much. Atlanta's going to throw it to Ridley and Julio over and over and over again. And so I think those guys are a little bit better floor plays than Tyreek Hill. And I think they'll be a little bit lower owned. And I don't think their ceilings are that substantially different. So I probably like the Atlanta receivers a little bit more than Tyreek tonight in terms of lineup construction.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's going to play Julian Edelman. Like I haven't done ownership projections, so don't take what I'm saying as gospel. I spent so much time doing them for the main slate. I've hardly thought about it for this, but I would actually think that Russell Gage would be more owned than Julian Edelman on this slate as people try to save some money to fit in Elaire and Aaron Jones, and they're not excited about playing Edelman with Hoyer, which quite frankly, I am not excited about playing Edelman with Hoyer either. Going back to the projections, Leone, I'm shocked that 6K Julio isn't just projecting off the freaking rails. I mean, 6K Julio is out of control. Tell other people what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, in general, the projections are a little bit conservative on the Atlanta side of things. All 3 guys are questionable. I might tweak that a little bit before we get to lock, but just some concern there injury-wise. And they have a lot of guys to throw to. Russell Gage's targets per out run has been really high to begin the season. He's been getting looked at quite a bit. Calvin Ridley looks like there's a chance he might ascend to being the wide receiver 1 there. So, Julio's a phenomenal play at 6K, but that's the reason why the projection's tempered. I think if anything, the projection on Julio, if we were wrong, we'd probably be wrong a little bit low on Julio, and we'd probably be wrong a little bit high on Edelman and Tyreek Hill. The concern with Tyreek Hill is just for a expensive receiver, he needs some big plays, especially in a game where they might control the game and they might not run a whole ton of plays if they're turning clock, if they can just handle New England successfully. So I'm with you. I think I was starting to build the chalk pieces in the DraftKings system here. If you're hand building too, if you're playing Mahomes, you're probably going to the KC guys as cheap. You've got Watkins and Hardman as your little 4Ks, clear up some cap space if you're playing Mahomes and the expensive running backs. And then, you can see and hear the DVP rank that DraftKings default has, and they have KC as the best team against wide receivers. So the people hand building, that's just another reason on top of Cam Newton being out, that they're going to look elsewhere. So I wonder if Edelman, and I know you love N'Keal Harry, Adam, at 3,900, the ownership there, I think it's going to be off those guys more than it should be. They're probably going to have to, they're probably going to have to throw more than they have to start the year, even though the quarterback's worse.
Well, actually, I actually think N'Keal Harry is better without Cam a little bit, just because at least he has a chance for a touchdown now near the goal line, and that's where N'Keal Harry was going to win anyways. Like,
Mr. N'Keal got tackled at the 1 yard line 2 weeks in a row. Harry, I know. Forget about that.
Yeah, let's forget about that. Okay, I also want to talk about the Green Bay wide receivers. I think people are going to try to save money there. They see all these guys are hurt. Let me read you the routes run from last week. Allen Lazard ran 35. He is not playing in this game. MVS was next with 34. Then Shepard with 16. Then Tyler Ervin, who I already mentioned, he's eligible at the running back position, with 13. Then Malik Turner down with 2. And so they called up Reggie Bagleton from the practice squad. It looks like former CFL star. Talented dude, I think. It's hard to say if he's going to play over any of these guys like Turner or Shepard. Do you have any feeling here, either of you? I'll start with Leone. Do you have any feeling on how it's going to rotate through for the Packers wide receivers? Because they are very cheap.
I know I'm worried about Malik Taylor, who had played a bunch of snaps in week 2 when Devontae Adams went out, and we kind of thought he would be the wide receiver 3 last week because of that, but he might just be in that special teams role. Shout out to Cody, who does our showdown work, but he was saying, he might have just benefited from being active as a special teamer that week, and they had to play him. And then last week, we saw Darius Shepard play 37% of the snaps. He still only saw 1 target. I've got the target share and snap share up on the screen for you guys from last week. So I think it's going to be Shepard as wide receiver 2. Oh my God, it's so ugly. But I think it's going to be Shepard as wide receiver 2. He's the 3K guy I would most like to play. I'll look into Bagleton a bit more. I think he was a CFL guy because one of my friends, Ben Kramer, has been talking to me about him quite a bit, and he's a big CFL fan. But I think it's going to be Shepard. I think we're going to see Irvin maybe play some slot snaps and steal some share there. But I was talking to Drew when I was trying to figure this out, and really, I mean, we're at the wide receiver position, but we think they're going to run just a lot of 2 tight end stuff. Which could be hard. And then that's where it gets confusing too, though, because you've got Sternberger and Robert Tonyan, but Mercedes Lewis is doubtful, who had a 7% target share last week, and Josiah DeGuara is questionable. So they might not have 3 tight ends. So it's a tough situation.
You will find once the enact is released, you'll find in our showdown breakdown, you will find our updated projections and everything updated for the news there. Also, Leone brought up the DVP on DraftKings. Please, for the love of God, do not use the DVP on DraftKings to make any decisions. We have DVP stuff built in on the site. We have ratings by position there, percentage over expectation, that I think is much better than what DraftKings uses, which is more of the raw thing, which is pretty much all going to be based on schedule. Okay. Anything else on wide receiver you guys want to mention before we move on? Because
the thing that I'll just mention in general on a 2-game slate is a single cheap wide receiver that makes like 1 big play can really be the difference in the slate. So if you're building a lot of lineups, having some exposure to some of the guys that we're unclear on what their role will be makes a lot of sense, because if we're unclear on it, the general public isn't even going to have heard of these guys and know to click them. They're going to see like Darius Shepard and be like, there's 6 other 3K guys. Those guys aren't going to get clicked. So in terms of trying to generate unique lineups and trying to deliver more expected value, there is benefit to just mixing those guys in. Don't be afraid to leave some salary on lineup builds as well. Like that's another thing that you can do to be a little bit differentiated from the field. I don't think you necessarily need to like force it, but be okay with if you have a lineup that ends up at like 48-8 on this slate, like that's okay because it's a 2-game slate.
The people want a rule or two from you, Dink. Are there any rules that you think you're gonna make tonight? Don't give people all your rules, just maybe one or two.
Yeah, I don't think I'll have too many. I will make sure that I allow at least 2. I might go up to 3 offensive players versus my defense. I think that's totally fine. I think if you're using optimizers, the default is often 0, and that can get you in trouble on a 2-game slate. And then I will for sure make it so that if I'm using a quarterback, I'm using at least 2 pass catchers with them. I definitely want 2 pass catchers with all the quarterbacks.
Can you respond to Peter Jennings, who wants to talk about the double dip with
this? You want to talk about Adam Levitan's classic? It's enough already. We are on 6 years of this double dip thing.
Has it ever
How
hit?
many times does it work?
It's never hit. It's the most ridiculous correlation I've ever heard. Peter's a great DFS player, and he has just latched on to this horrific concept of the double dip. That literally the only place it might make sense is like showdown lineups.
Devin DuVernay last week and the it still didn't get there. It still didn't get there.
Still didn't get there. So no, ignore the double dip.
That's the sick thing, is that it's hit a few times, but nobody ever wins any money with it because the rest of their lineup is such bust anyways. Do you know what I mean?
The 1% hit rate, 0.1% payoff.
All right, let's go to tight end because I'm excited. Evan and I have a monster team in FFPC, and we're starting Robert Tonyan tonight, and we need some points from him. And I'm excited about how the dominoes have kind of fallen for Robert Tonyan here, who's been referred to as Baby Kittle, extremely athletic guy. They used a 3rd-round pick on Jay Sternberger, but Robert Tonyan beat him out. And last week, Robert Tonyan ran 22 routes. Jay Sternberger ran 8. Mercedes Lewis, who Leone mentioned is listed doubtful, ran 5. I think Tanyan's going to be very popular, Leone, because if you're playing the expensive running backs, it's hard to fit Kelsey also. And then the next best tight end, I think, is going to be Tonyan. So what do you think about the tight end spot tonight and Robert Tonyan, Leone?
Yeah, I think he's a great play. I actually think we have him projecting, better than Hayden Hurst, which might surprise some people, but Hurst is in that role for Atlanta that Hooper played. I know he did well last year. These guys have a good floor because Atlanta just throws so much and Matt Ryan's a really good quarterback, but they're 4th in the pecking order, especially with Russell Gage increasing his targets per route run and the tight end position for Atlanta. Whereas Green Bay, I mean, they have to, you mentioned the routes they ran last week. It wasn't a ton of routes, but these guys were all targeted, pretty good. Together, they combined for, nearly a third of the team's targets last week. And it's an even more desperate situation this week. Tight ends with Aaron Rodgers historically have really high TD rates. So we're expecting, almost half a touchdown from Robert Tonyan, which is pretty high for a guy that doesn't have a really big target share. So he might be the best tight end play in a vacuum because you don't sacrifice a whole ton of value by not paying up for Kelsey. And I think, you obviously would prioritize the running backs and a primary build over paying up for Kelsey.
Sure. Paying up for Kelsey, I think, is an interesting discussion, Drew, because he's one of the few players on the slate. I mentioned how it's hard to find guys on a 2-game slate who can beat other guys. Like I could see Kelsey beating Aaron Jones. And so that might be a decision that people have. I can't fit both Jones and Allaire and Kelsey. What do I do? Well, the Kelsey lines are for sure going to be more contrarian. What do you think about how Kelsey fits on this slate?
I just saw the comment come up. Imagine double dipping in 2020 during a pandemic. That is a great comment. That is a fantastic comment. Well played. I think Kelsey's ownership will be similar to that of the wide receivers kind of priced around him. The Ridley, the Julio, that kind of group. I don't think there'll be a big differentiator between the ownerships there. I think he gets a little bit of an advantage by being at that onesie position that he could potentially dominate in terms of ownership. It's interesting to me. I would have thought just on kind of like a more casual slate that Hayden Hurst might garner more ownership than Tonyan on this slate. I think the Sharps will play Tonyan at a higher percentage than Hurst, but I think that'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. The one caveat that I'll give to that is that the Atlanta wide receivers are going to be so popular that people might just be uncomfortable like clicking on a 3rd or 4th receiving option from Atlanta. So that maybe that does flip it to Tonyan. The last thing that I want to talk about though is, I posed this to the guy who's clearly the most experienced at winning GPPs with a $2,500 zero. So you, Mike Leone, could a $2,500 zero tight end end up winning this 2-game slate today? Somebody like Nick Kreiser or Deion Yelder or Josiah Deguara. Like, can these $2,500 guys, are they in play?
I don't think so. I think, especially because I think there's going to be so much overlap in your roster that just getting some points here is going to be a really big deal. It's not like you can differentiate yourself with a 4% running back who smashes like you can on a main slate. So every point counts. And I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we have 3 tight ends tonight that are top 5 on the main slate, or top 6 would have been. The main slate was just so gross. And I would probably take shots on the Green Bay. If DeGuara plays, him and Sternberger, I would take shots on both of them. As really good leverage plays off Tanyan, where even though they project much worse than Tanyan, if you just run pure on touchdown luck, all of a sudden that flips. Like, let's say Sternberger catches a touchdown and Tanyan doesn't. Well, all of a sudden, our projection for Sternberger would be 3 points higher than Tanyan rather than the other way around. So that's where I would go. I have another interesting thought though is like what happens with the New England tight end situation. Izzo saw some targets week 1. I don't think he's seen practically anything the last 2 weeks, but does that change? Does Ozzy run some more routes or play some more? So, I definitely wouldn't play Yelder or Kaiser, but I could maybe see playing Ozzy. I wouldn't play Stalker at all. I would play any Green Bay tight end that's active.
One thing I wanted to mention there that you just mentioned, leverage is, I think it's something that we're trying to teach, each and every week in my GPP article on the Establish the Million show. But I think sometimes people mistake like a good GPP play in terms of the results. Like yesterday, for example, a lot of people were tweeting at me like Latavius Murray was a great call or whatever. I had no idea Latavius Murray was going to score 2 touchdowns. The reason I recommended Latavius Murray had nothing to do with the fact that I thought he was going to score 2 touchdowns. It had everything to do with the fact that if Alvin Kamara, the highest owned player on the slate, fails, what is the way that he fails? He fails by Latavius Murray getting rushing touchdowns. And thus, you have leverage on the highest owned play on the slate. And so that's what Mike was talking about and alluding to with Sternberger or DeGuara here, is not that they're great plays, not that we expect them to necessarily do anything, but if they do, it's likely at the expense of Tanyan, who's higher owned. And that's the way to think about GPP plays. It's not to think about like getting the prediction right of the guy that you think is going to be low owned actually scoring something. It's, does that guy, if he does well, does he elevate you above the field quicker than other guys that do well? And that's what leverage really, really matters in GPPs.
Yep. Okay. That was a brief break from our team play the best plays segment. Now we're going to go back to defense before we wrap this up here. I'm not sure there's a lot to say about defense. Obviously, by far, the best raw projection is going to go to the Chiefs against Brian Hoyer. I'm not sure if Chris Jones is playing or not, but Brandon Thorne, who I think does one of our most valuable pieces in terms of offensive line, defensive line mismatch, did have Chiefs defensive line over Patriots offensive line in his top 6. That was on the assumption that Chris Jones would play. How do you feel, Leone, about paying for the Chiefs here? I think spending $4K might make them not as owned as maybe they should be. And you see this a lot on main slates where, $4K and 3,900 defenses are not owned at the rate they should be if you were going by median projection. The thing is, as we've talked about all offseason, getting a defense right is so hard. I mean, the Bucs yesterday, I'm sick. Okay, Chris Jones is out. Thank you. Definitely a big downgrade to Chiefs defensive line. Doesn't mean that they can't still smash against Brian Hoyer. But anyways, I'm sick over paying $3,400 for the Bucs on the main slate yesterday. Maybe that's being too results oriented. But anyways, what do you think about the Chiefs in this spot, Leone?
Yeah, I think they're a really good play just because, they're going to face pass attempts in a positive game script at home against a shaky quarterback situation, a shaky wide receiver situation. And as you mentioned, with all the other defenses being sub 3K, I don't know if people are going to want to get up to them. They're going to pay for the really expensive running backs. The thing is, though, people could easily make lineups without any Patriots tonight, which might put people on the Chiefs just because they really don't want to play players against their defense. So I'm torn on if they'll make the effort to pay up or not. I think regardless, the Packers ends up super chalky as the other favored team against a team that's going to throw a lot. It makes sense. If you were making a cash game lineup, it would probably be the Packers where you get the savings, similar value to the Chiefs. But play some Falcons-Patriots defense. I think the Falcons defense at 2,200 makes sense. Rodgers will hold on to the ball. He'll take sacks. I know he doesn't throw picks, but he will take some sacks. I'm trying to hold on to the ball because he won't throw some picks. And just a game that could get into one of those shootout games, and it's just one big play. It could get the Falcons defense there. And people really, I don't think, are going to play the Falcons defense I'd rather play them than the Patriots defense, where I just don't see Mahomes making a lot of mistakes. And I think they control the game enough that, the Mahomes isn't going to be out there taking a lot of sacks, whereas, you could see Rodgers take sacks even if the Packers offense rolls.
Yeah.
One big thing I'll note on these small slates: spread your defensive exposure. Just in general, this is one of the positions that can get most lopsided in terms of ownership, because people think they can identify the right play better than everybody else. And so I would expect the Chiefs and the Packers to have quite a bit of ownership as bigger favorites, and obviously projecting as better defenses. But the gap in the projection on these is a few points here. And so even if the projection hits and all these projections play out exactly as it is, it's not hard to make up 2 or 3 points at other positions. And if the projections are wrong, because defense is really hard to project, and you get the one random play, you can get big leverage on the field just by having, if you had like 25% to each of these teams, there's going to be like 2 of the teams that you're going to be reasonably overweight, that if you run into the right thing, you can end up kind of leveraging yourself up the leaderboards.
Yeah, I think just in generally speaking, casual DFS players think far too much about points allowed when they're selecting a defense. And this goes more for the main slate, but I'm more thinking about how many times is the opposing quarterback going to drop back, and how often is the defense going to blitz? How good are their pass rushers? You can see all that in Brandon's article about the quality of the pass rush versus the offensive line. Okay, we've said enough here for a 2-game slate. I hope everybody enjoyed a look behind the curtain on this free YouTube Monday night live stream. Enjoy the 2-game slate. Reminder, you can head to the site. You can get a weekly pass. You can get a monthly pass. We still have annual pass available. And we do have the YouTube content here. Go ahead and hit subscribe to that. It's free. So for Mike, for producer Mike, for Drew, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.